The hat-trick will be remembered for as long as people talk about this World Cup. Lionel Messi, 38 years old, equaling Miroslav Klose's all-time record of 16 World Cup goals in a single extraordinary night against Algeria. Argentina won 3-0. It should have been one of the cleanest, most uncomplicated stories of the tournament's opening week. The greatest player of his generation, producing one final towering performance on the world's biggest stage in what is almost certainly his last World Cup. The kind of moment that writes itself into history without argument, without asterisk, without any of the noise that so often surrounds football's biggest nights. Instead, 3 days later, the Algerian Football Federation sent a formal letter to FIFA's headquarters in Zurich. Not a press conference held in the heat of the moment, not a social media post venting frustration after a disappointing result, not an off-the-record briefing to a sympathetic journalist, an official complaint submitted through the proper institutional channels, naming specific incidents, specific players, and specific officials, and formally asking football's governing body to explain how its own laws were applied, or in Algeria's view, weren't applied during that match. So, what is really happening here? And why has a 3-0 defeat, 4 days after the final whistle, turned into one of the most serious institutional disputes of this entire tournament? Why does this complaint carry a weight that goes beyond the frustration of a team that lost a football match and simply doesn't want to accept it? Let's start with what the complaint actually says, because the details matter enormously here, and they go well beyond the single moment that dominated headlines in the immediate aftermath of the game. According to Algerian outlets citing official federation sources, the protest centers on 2 specific incidents. Both occurred in the first half. Both involved Argentina players, and both, according to Algeria, were left unpunished by referee Simon Marcinic and his VAR team based in the tournament's review center. The first is the one the world has already debated extensively. In the 32nd minute, Messi's studs made contact with Algerian defender Issa Mandi, raking down from knee to ankle in a manner that brought Mandi to the ground and required him to receive treatment on the pitch. Marcinic blew his whistle for the foul. He did not produce a card of any color. He did not pause play for a formal pitch-side review at the monitor. VAR examined the footage from multiple angles and ultimately found no clear and obvious error in the on-field decision, allowing the match to continue without interruption, without further scrutiny, and without any additional action taken against the player responsible for the challenge. The Algerian Federation's position, stated formally in their complaint submitted to Zurich, is that this was a sending-off worthy offense under the laws of the game as they are written. Their argument is not merely that Marcinic made a subjective call that reasonable people might disagree about. It is that the failure to act on it, and crucially, the failure of the VAR team to intervene and correct it, represents exactly the kind of decisive officiating error that VAR technology was designed, built, and implemented specifically to correct. The whole premise of the system is that it exists to catch what the referee misses or gets wrong in real time. In Algeria's formal submission to FIFA, that premise failed them entirely that night. The second incident has received far less public attention, but in some ways it is just as significant to the overall structure of Algeria's case. According to the Federation's complaint, Liverpool midfielder Alexis McAllister struck 18-year-old Algerian forward Ibrahim Maza with what the Federation formally describes as a deliberate elbow, delivered away from the ball and away from the referee's immediate line of sight. The officiating crew, Algeria says in their letter, ignored the incident completely. No foul was given, no review was conducted, no card was shown. There was no acknowledgement from anyone on the officiating team that the contact had occurred at all, let alone that it warranted any kind of examination under the technology available to them. Put those 2 incidents together, and Algeria's argument becomes something far more specific and far more structurally serious than a simple emotional reaction to losing a football match. Their case, laid out across the formal letter sent to Zurich, is that had both situations been correctly assessed under the existing laws of the game, Argentina could realistically have been reduced to 10 men for the better part of an entire first half. A team missing one of its most influential and dangerous attacking players for that length of time, against a side fighting hard for something meaningful in their World Cup return, changes the entire tactical landscape and the physical balance of a match in ways that are genuinely impossible to measure or reverse after the final whistle has already blown. Algeria's federation is not simply saying they were unlucky on the night, or that the referee had a difficult match, or even that decisions went against them in the kind of marginal, borderline way that football accepts happens from time to time in the flow of a game. They are formally arguing in writing, addressed directly to the sport's governing body, that the eventual scoreline may have been shaped in part by officiating decisions that did not follow the rules, as those rules are actually written. That is a serious allegation, and it deserves a serious response. Here is where things get more interesting and where the broader context becomes absolutely essential to understanding why this particular complaint carries the institutional weight that it does. Because this is not the first time Algeria's federation has taken this exact path when they felt wronged on the biggest stages. This is not a new playbook. This is an established pattern of behavior from an institution that has now challenged officiating decisions across 3 separate major tournaments in under 4 years. In 2022, after Algeria were eliminated from World Cup qualification by Cameroon on the away goals rule in the dying seconds of extra time, the federation lodged a formal appeal with FIFA. They described the officiating that night as scandalous. They demanded the match be replayed entirely. That request was reviewed through the proper channels and ultimately not granted. Algeria did not go to Qatar. The heartbreak of that elimination and the federation's very public institutional fight afterward became embedded in the team's recent history and in the way their supporters and officials understand their own relationship with football's governing structures. Then earlier this year, during Algeria's elimination from the Africa Cup of Nations quarterfinals against Nigeria, the federation went through the exact same formal process again. A complaint was lodged with both the Confederation of African Football and FIFA. This time, the complaint was accompanied by genuinely ugly scenes on the pitch itself, with the match referee needing to be physically escorted away from confrontations involving Algerian staff members. The federation was subsequently fined $100,000 by CAF for the conduct of players, staff, and supporters that day, including supporters who reportedly waved banknotes in the direction of match officials, in a gesture that needed no translation. Their appeal against those sanctions remains ongoing as this World Cup has unfolded. This pattern matters enormously, and it would be wrong to dismiss it or reduce it to a simple narrative about a federation that refuses to accept losing. Because if you step back from any one of these individual incidents and look at all 3 of them together, the 2022 World Cup qualifying elimination, the 2024 AFCON quarterfinal, and now this World Cup match against Argentina, what you are looking at is an institution that has now formally challenged officiating decisions across 3 major tournaments in under 4 years. Whatever you ultimately think of the individual merits of any single complaint, the consistency of the Federation's response tells you something important about an organization that genuinely believes it faces a recurring and structural problem on the world's biggest stages. This is not one bad night producing one frustrated reaction. This is an institution documenting what it believes is a systemic pattern. Now bring in the wider context of this specific World Cup, because Algeria's complaint does not exist in isolation from everything else that has happened around officiating and VAR in the tournament's opening week. It is, in fact, the 3rd major VAR controversy of these opening days alone. The first came in the Switzerland against Qatar match, where a penalty was awarded and upheld following an offside review, and the decisive visual evidence behind that decision was never shown publicly to the watching world. Pundits, including Gary Neville, said directly on air that the call appeared wrong to his eyes and that FIFA owed the global television audience considerably clearer visual evidence to justify and explain the decision. Ian Wright went further, calling the lack of transparency around the ruling scandalous and stating that the governing body appeared to simply be doing what it wanted without any accountability to the hundreds of millions of people watching. The second controversy was the Messi incident itself, debated at length by broadcasters and former professionals across multiple platforms well before Algeria's federation had even filed anything formally with FIFA. Former Manchester City and England youth international Nedum Onuoha, watching the same replays available to every viewer at home, said plainly on air that he believed it should have been a red card and that the decision fed directly into a broader narrative, one that has followed football for a long time, that the game's biggest individual stars receive a fundamentally different standard of treatment from match officials than everyone else on the pitch. Thierry Henry, working as a pundit for this tournament's broadcast coverage, acknowledged openly that many people genuinely believed Messi deserved to be sent off that night, in what is technically part of his World Cup farewell campaign at the age of 38. That acknowledgement from someone of Henry's stature, a player who himself experienced some of the most controversial VAR and refereeing moments in the history of the competition, carries a particular weight. That is the environment into which Algeria's formal complaint has now landed. Not as an isolated grievance from a single team that lost a football match and is looking for excuses, but as the most institutionally serious expression yet of a pattern that television pundits, decorated former players, and now a full National Football Federation have all independently identified and articulated across this tournament's very first week of matches. 3 separate controversies. 3 separate sets of questions about consistency, transparency, and the practical application of a system that was sold to the footballing world as the final word in fairness. This matters deeply because of what VAR was originally built to do. The system exists specifically and explicitly to correct exactly the kind of decisive, match-altering errors that Algeria is formally alleging happened twice within the same opening half of the same game. If the technology and the protocols built around it are not being applied with genuine, verifiable, publicly demonstrable consistency, if a marginal offside call against a smaller footballing nation receives one level of intense scrutiny and immediate reversal, while a serious physical challenge from the tournament's most famous and commercially valuable player receives an entirely different standard of consideration, then the foundational premise of VAR as a tool for fairness across the entire competition, regardless of who is playing or who is watching, comes into entirely legitimate and serious question. The bigger issue beyond this single match and this single formal complaint is what a federation protest of this kind actually tends to achieve within FIFA's existing disciplinary framework. And here, the historical record is honest and straightforward. Post-match complaints of this kind, even when formally lodged through proper institutional channels, even when accompanied by specific time-stamped evidence pointing to identifiable moments in a recorded match, have rarely, if ever, resulted in overturned results or retrospective sanctions once a match has been completed and its official outcome stands in the record books. Algeria's 2022 appeal against Cameroon ultimately achieved nothing in terms of changing that outcome. Their complaint against Nigeria earlier this year remains pending, with no resolution that has altered their elimination from that tournament in any practical way. History suggests that the most realistic outcome of a complaint like this latest one is not a replayed match and not a reverse scoreline against Argentina. It is, at most, an internal review of the officiating team's conduct on that particular night, potentially affecting future match appointments for Martinique and his colleagues, alongside a formal acknowledgement or denial from FIFA's disciplinary or refereeing committee, delivered through internal channels and almost certainly never made fully public. That does not mean the complaint is without meaning or without consequence. Far from it. Algeria's federation is using the only formal institutional tool genuinely available to a nation that believes it has been wronged on the sport's biggest stage. They are putting their objection permanently on the official record in writing, addressed directly to the body responsible for appointing, training, and overseeing the officials in question. Even if it ultimately changes nothing about Argentina's 3-0 victory as it stands in the record books, it becomes part of the documented and permanent history of this tournament's opening week. It adds Algeria's voice, formally, institutionally, through the proper channels, to a chorus that by the end of these opening days included respected broadcasters, decorated former players, and now a full national governing body, all independently raising the same fundamental question about consistency, transparency, and officiating standards. Think carefully about what this means for the individual people caught directly in the middle of all of it. Ibrahim Maza is 18 years old. He was playing in his very first World Cup match. He was doing so against the reigning defending champions on the same night that Lionel Messi was making history at the opposite end of the pitch, equaling the all-time World Cup scoring record in one of the most watched football matches on the planet. Whatever precisely happened in that off-the-ball moment between Maza and Mac Allister, his own federation formally believes that he was struck by a deliberate elbow and that the officials responsible for policing the match missed it entirely. That is not simply a tactical grievance about a final scoreline. That is a young man's introduction to the World Cup stage, and his own National Football Federation standing up publicly, formally, and in writing to say that moment deserved considerably more scrutiny than it ultimately received from those tasked with applying the rules. For Algeria's supporters, who have followed this team through one heartbreaking and disputed elimination after another over the past several years, Cameroon in 2022, Nigeria earlier this year, and now this World Cup defeat carrying its own formal institutional complaint, this latest protest will read as entirely and painfully consistent with everything they have already watched their federation go through before. A recurring pattern, documented now across multiple competitions and multiple years, of genuinely feeling that the biggest moments against the biggest and most commercially significant opponents have not been officiated with the same rigor, the same scrutiny, and the same transparency applied to matches played lower down the football pyramid, away from the brightest lights and the largest global broadcast audiences. What happens next is genuinely uncertain, and it would be wrong and irresponsible to predict any specific outcome with confidence at this stage. FIFA will review the complaint through its standard internal disciplinary and refereeing assessment processes, as it does with every formal complaint submitted by a member federation through the proper channels. Martinique and his VAR team may face an internal review of their performance that particular night, a process entirely separate from any public statement the governing body chooses to make, or, as is often the case, chooses not to make. It remains highly unlikely that the result itself will be altered in any way. Football's governing bodies have consistently and historically treated completed match outcomes as final and binding regardless of officiating disputes raised by aggrieved federations in the aftermath. The record on this question is clear and consistent. Completed results do not get reversed because of a complaint, however formally lodged and however seriously argued. That is simply not how the system works, and no one within the Algerian Federation is likely to genuinely believe that this outcome is within the realistic range of possibilities. What is far more plausible, and what may ultimately prove to be the most significant consequence of this entire situation, is that this becomes another significant documented data point in the broader ongoing conversation about VAR consistency at this specific tournament, sitting alongside the Switzerland-Qatar incident as further evidence that something in the system's transparency and practical application genuinely needs to be addressed, examined, and corrected before the knockout rounds begin in earnest. Because when the tournament moves into the elimination stages, the stakes will be higher, the scrutiny will be more intense, the broadcast audiences will be larger, and the consequences of any similar decision, delivered with the same lack of transparency that has already characterized the opening weekends, will only intensify dramatically and irreversibly. The hat-trick will be remembered, the record will stand, Argentina's 3-0 victory will remain in the official books exactly as it was recorded on the night. But alongside that story, formally and permanently, sits Algeria's complaint. And alongside that complaint sit the questions it raises about consistency, about fairness, about whether the technology football spent years debating and implementing is actually being used in the way it was promised it would be. Those questions are not going away. If anything, in the weeks to come, they may only grow louder.